A homeless Navy SEAL inherited a dead maple farm. Then his dog uncovered the secret men were killing for. Garrett Boone spent his nights sleeping inside a rusted pickup beneath a Denver overpass, with only his retired military dog, Hawk, beside him. Then a stranger handed him the deed to an abandoned maple farm hidden deep in the Vermont mountains. But when Hawk discovered a hidden bunker beneath the sugar house, Garrett uncovered a buried conspiracy tied to his family, his war, and powerful men who would do anything to silence the truth. Comment 1 if you'd fight to protect your family's land, or 0 if you'd walk away, and tell us where you're watching from. Snow drifted sideways beneath the interstate overpass, carried by a bitter January wind that rattled loose sheets of metal somewhere in the darkness above. The city of Denver groaned around it all, sirens in the distance, tires hissing across wet pavement, trains moaning through the industrial district like tired ghosts moving through the night. Under the overpass, tucked behind a row of concrete barriers stained black from years of exhaust and rainwater, sat an old rusted Ford pickup with faded blue paint and one cracked headlight held together with duct tape. Inside the truck, Garrett Boone slept in fragments. Not real sleep. Never real sleep anymore. His body jerked suddenly beneath a pile of army blankets as another nightmare ripped through him. His breathing turned sharp and uneven. His right hand clenched instinctively toward the empty spot beside the seat where a rifle should have been. The explosion came again in his mind. Sand. Smoke. Blood. The screaming over the radio. Then silence. Garrett's eyes snapped open. For one disoriented second, he stared through the fogged windshield, searching for incoming fire that no longer existed. His chest heaved hard. Cold sweat soaked the collar of his thermal shirt, despite the freezing air inside the truck. Beside him, a Belgian Malinois slowly lifted his head. The dog's muzzle had turned gray with age, and a jagged scar cut through the fur above one eye. One ear stood upright, while the other folded halfway down from an old injury overseas. His name was Hawk. The dog rested his chin gently against Garrett's arm, grounding him, pulling him back. Garrett swallowed hard and rubbed a shaking hand across Hawk's neck. "It's all right, buddy," he whispered hoarsely. "Just another bad one." Hawk stayed pressed against him until Garrett's breathing slowed. Outside, snowflakes swirled through the yellow glow of a flickering street lamp. Garrett checked the dashboard clock. 2:14 a.m. He hadn't slept more than 2 hours straight in almost 11 years. Not since Kandahar. Not since Operation Black Tide. Not since 6 men under his command never came home. Garrett leaned back against the cracked vinyl seat and stared through the windshield. The city beyond the overpass blurred behind drifting snow and exhaustion. 56 years old, decorated former Navy SEAL, and homeless. Funny how life worked out sometimes. A month ago, he'd still had a cheap motel room on the edge of Aurora and a warehouse job unloading freight trucks during the night shift. It wasn't much, but it kept gas in the truck and food in Hawk's bowl. Then the forklift backfired. One loud metallic bang. That was all it took. Suddenly, Garrett was back in Afghanistan again. Back inside a burning convoy. Back listening to men scream over shattered radios. He'd hit the concrete before he even realized what was happening. By the time he came to himself, 2 security guards were pinning him down, while terrified workers stared from across the loading dock. The manager fired him before sunrise, said Garrett was unstable, said he was a liability, said the dog scared people too. Garrett hadn't argued. What was the point? He had enough savings left for 4 nights at the motel. After that, it was the truck. Now even the truck was running low on gas. Garrett rubbed both hands together and glanced at the small propane heater balanced carefully near the passenger floorboard. The flame inside flickered weakly, almost empty. Perfect. Everything in his life lately seemed to run on fumes. Hawk suddenly lifted his head again. Low growl, soft, alert. Garrett immediately straightened. Even exhausted, some instincts never died. What is it? Hawk stared through the windshield toward the street beyond the concrete barriers. A figure approached through the snow. Woman. Long dark coat, leather boots crunching carefully across the icy pavement. Garrett's muscles tightened automatically. The woman stopped several feet from the truck and raised both hands slightly. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she called through the wind. Garrett didn't answer immediately. Nobody came looking for homeless veterans at 2 a.m. unless they wanted something. The woman reached slowly into her coat pocket and removed a business card. "My name is Evelyn Price, Balsung," she said. "I'm an attorney." Garrett almost laughed at that. "Lady, if this is about unpaid parking tickets, you're wasting your time." "It's not." Her voice remained calm, professional, controlled. "It's about your uncle." The words hit harder than they should have. Garrett frowned. "I don't have an uncle." "Yes," Evelyn said quietly. "You did." Silence settled between them except for the distant sound of traffic overhead. Garrett slowly opened the truck door. Freezing air swept inside instantly. Hawk climbed out first, positioning himself protectively beside Garrett's leg. The dog watched Evelyn carefully, but didn't bark. Evelyn noticed the old military tattoo on Garrett's neck as he stepped beneath the overpass light. She also noticed the exhaustion in his eyes, and the way his hands never stopped moving slightly, as if his nervous system had forgotten how to fully stand down. "You found me," Garrett said cautiously. "Congratulations. Now tell me what this is." Evelyn studied him for a moment before speaking. "Your uncle Walter Boone passed away 3 weeks ago in Blackwater Ridge, Vermont." The name hit Garrett strangely. Walter Boone. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in over 30 years. A memory flickered briefly in his mind. Cold autumn air, a flannel jacket, the smell of maple syrup. Then nothing. Gone again. Garrett folded his arms tightly against the cold. "I figured he was dead years ago." Evelyn nodded once. "He left instructions for me to locate you personally." "That must have been difficult." It was. Garrett looked away toward the snow-covered street. "Well," he muttered, "guess he finally got what he wanted." Evelyn frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Garrett gave a bitter shrug. "The old man hated me." "That's not what I was told." Garrett let out a humorless laugh. "When I was 19, I wrote him from Coronado after Bud's graduation. Never answered." Another memory surfaced. Standing beside a mailbox on base, waiting weeks for a reply that never came. "I wrote him again after my first deployment," Garrett continued quietly. Nothing. Snow drifted across the pavement between them. "Then my wife died," Garrett said. Still nothing. His jaw tightened. "So yeah, pretty safe to say Walter Boone wasn't exactly interested in family." Evelyn listened carefully, but said nothing for several seconds. Finally, she opened the leather folder beneath her arm. "He left you something." Garrett almost smiled. "What? Debt?" "Inheritance." That word sounded ridiculous beneath the overpass. Inheritance belonged to other people. People with houses and families and retirement plans. not washed-up seals sleeping inside dead pickup trucks. Evelyn handed him several documents. Garrett glanced down. Property records, tax notices, legal forms. Then one photograph slipped free and fluttered into the snow. Garrett bent down slowly and picked it up. A farmhouse stood beneath towering maple trees buried in snow. Old, weathered, lonely. Something about it twisted unexpectedly inside his chest. "That's the Boone farm," Evelyn said softly. "Blackwater Ridge, Vermont." Garrett stared at the photograph. "I haven't seen this place since I was a kid." "Your uncle left it to you." Garrett blinked once. "What?" "The house, the land, the maple operation, everything." Garrett looked back up sharply. "No. It's all legally yours now." "That's impossible. It's already been filed through probate court." Garrett shook his head slowly. "He wouldn't do that." "He did." Hawk leaned gently against Garrett's leg as wind howled beneath the overpass. Garrett studied the paperwork again. Nearly 200 acres. Maple forest. Sugar house, farm equipment. Then he saw the number listed near the bottom. Back taxes owed. His stomach sank immediately. Jesus Christ. The debt was enormous. Years of unpaid taxes and penalties stacked together into a crushing amount. "That's why you tracked me down personally?" Garrett muttered bitterly. "To hand me a financial grenade?" "There's more." Evelyn removed another document. Corporate letterhead. Iron Vale Development. Garrett frowned. "They made an offer on the land," Evelyn explained. "A very large one." He looked at the number. Even in his current condition, it stunned him. Enough money to change everything. A house, medical treatment, a future. Maybe even peace if such a thing still existed for men like him. "They've been trying to buy the property for years," Evelyn said carefully. Garrett stared at the snowy photograph again. "Why?" Evelyn hesitated. That hesitation changed something. Garrett noticed immediately. Seal instincts. Always watching. Always reading people. "What aren't you telling me?" The attorney looked past him toward the darkness beyond the overpass. Snow continued falling steadily. Finally, she met his eyes again. "Your uncle spent years refusing to sell that land," she said quietly. Her voice lowered further. "And people died trying to take it." Silence. Even the city noise suddenly felt distant. Garrett looked down at the photograph again. The lonely farmhouse beneath the frozen mountains. For the first time all night, something other than exhaustion moved through him. Not hope, not yet. But curiosity. Dangerous curiosity. And somewhere deep beneath years of grief and numbness, the faintest feeling that maybe his story wasn't over after all. Garrett barely slept the rest of the night. The photograph of the farmhouse sat on the dashboard while snow continued falling beyond the windshield. Every so often he would glance at it again, trying to connect the image to the scattered fragments of memory buried somewhere deep in his mind. A porch swing creaking in summer wind, the smell of pine smoke, a rough hand lifting him onto broad shoulders, then darkness again, like trying to hold water in his hands. By dawn, the storm had weakened. Pale gray light spilled across the frozen city as traffic slowly returned to the interstate overhead. Garrett stepped out of the truck and stretched stiff muscles that ached from years of abuse and cold weather. Hawk jumped down beside him, paws crunching against thin ice. The old dog watched Garrett carefully, always watching him. always reading him better than any human ever had. Garrett rubbed the side of Hawk's neck while studying the eastern sky. "You want to go see a farm, buddy?" Hawk's ears twitched slightly. "That makes one of us." The truck coughed twice before finally starting. Garrett checked his fuel gauge, barely above empty. Perfect. He looked once more at the legal paperwork Evelyn Price had left behind. The offer from Iron Vale Development remained clipped neatly to the top. Enough money to disappear forever. Enough money to stop surviving day to day. A smarter man probably would have taken the deal immediately. But something about the photograph bothered him. Not the farm itself. The feeling attached to it. Like unfinished business waiting in the mountains. Garrett shoved the paperwork into the glove compartment and pulled onto the icy street. Denver slowly disappeared behind him beneath low winter clouds. Hour after hour, the highway carried them east through endless plains buried beneath snow. Windmills turned slowly in frozen fields. Old barns leaned crookedly against the horizon, like exhausted men refusing to fall over. Hawk slept most of the morning, curled beneath Garrett's arm. Garrett envied him. The dog still knew how to rest. Around noon, Garrett stopped at a gas station outside Ogallala, Nebraska. He pumped $30 into the truck and counted the cash left in his wallet afterward. $108. That was everything. As he stood beside the pump beneath sharp winter wind, a loud metallic clang suddenly erupted nearby when a mechanic dropped a steel tool tray. Garrett froze instantly. His pulse exploded. The gas station vanished. The freezing air vanished. Suddenly he was back in Afghanistan again. Gunfire. Dust storms. The scream of incoming mortars. His breathing turned ragged as adrenaline flooded his body. Hawk reacted immediately. The Malinois pressed hard against Garrett's leg, grounding him before the spiral could fully take hold. "Easy," Garrett muttered through clenched teeth. A young cashier watched nervously through the gas station window, while Garrett struggled to steady himself. The mechanic who dropped the tray raised both hands apologetically. "Sorry, man." Garrett nodded once but couldn't speak yet. His hands shook badly as he climbed back into the truck. For several miles afterward, silence filled the cab except for the sound of tires humming against wet asphalt. "You're getting worse," Garrett admitted quietly. Hawk simply rested his head against the seat beside him. By the second night, the landscape had changed. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills and dense forests heavy with snow. The roads narrowed. Towns grew smaller. Mountains slowly appeared through the gray distance like sleeping giants. Garrett crossed into Vermont just before dawn on the third morning. The White Mountains rose around the highway, their dark pine forests wrapped beneath layers of fog and ice. Snow drifted softly through the trees, while frozen rivers cut silver lines through the valleys below. It was beautiful. Painfully beautiful. Garrett hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd seen real wilderness untouched by concrete and noise. Hawk lifted his head as they climbed deeper into the mountains. The dog suddenly seemed more alert, restless. He kept staring out the windows toward the forest. "What do you see?" Garrett asked quietly. Hawk gave a low rumble in his throat, but didn't look away from the trees. By late afternoon, Garrett finally spotted the weathered wooden sign beside the road. Blackwater Ridge, population 1,842, snow covered most of the lettering. The town itself looked like something frozen in another decade. Small brick storefronts lined the narrow main street. Old pickup trucks sat buried beneath snowbanks. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys while Christmas lights still hung across several porches despite January being nearly over. The mountains surrounded the town completely. Beautiful. Isolated. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Garrett immediately hated how exposed that made him feel. He parked outside a diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "Clara, sir." The moment he stepped inside, warmth and the smell of coffee wrapped around him. Conversations slowed, not stopped completely, but slowed enough. People looked up from their meals, looked at Garrett, then at Hawk, then back again. Garrett recognized the feeling instantly. Outsider. The diner carried the quiet rhythm of a mountain town surviving winter together. Old country music played softly from a radio near the kitchen. A group of older men in flannel jackets sat near the counter drinking coffee. One of them stared openly at Garrett's seal trident tattoo before quickly looking away. A waitress approached carrying a coffee pot. She looked somewhere in her early 50s with tired but kind eyes and dark hair pulled into a loose braid. "You can sit anywhere you'd like," she said gently. Garrett nodded toward Hawk. "He stays with me." The waitress glanced at the scarred Malinois. "That dog looks smarter than half the men in here. He's welcome." A few people chuckled softly. Garrett took a booth near the window. Hawk settled immediately beside him, never taking his eyes off the room. The waitress poured coffee. "You passing through?" she asked. "Maybe. You got a name?" "Garrett Boone." The reaction was immediate. The waitress froze slightly. One of the older men near the counter turned slowly in his seat. Another exchanged a glance with him. Garrett noticed every bit of it. The waitress studied him more carefully now. "Boone," she repeated quietly. Garrett nodded once. Something softened in her expression. "My name's Clara Whitmore," she said. "Your uncle used to come in every Friday morning." Garrett looked up sharply. "You knew Walter?" "Knew him most of my life." Clara glanced toward the snow-covered mountains outside the window. "He always sat right there." She pointed toward the corner booth near the coffee station. "Ordered black coffee and blueberry pie." Garrett followed her gaze. The booth sat empty now, waiting. "He talked about you sometimes," Clara continued softly. Garrett frowned immediately. "That doesn't sound like Walter Boone." Clara gave him a sad little smile. "He called you his soldier." Something tightened painfully in Garrett's chest. "He used to say someday you'd come home through those mountains." Garrett looked down at the steam rising from his coffee cup. "No offense," he muttered, "but I don't think the old man and I remembered each other the same way." Clara hesitated. Then she quietly slid a slice of blueberry pie onto the table in front of him. "First meal's on the house." Garrett stared at it. "I can pay." "I know." That somehow made it worse. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then one of the older men near the counter slowly stood and walked toward Garrett's booth. Tall, broad shoulders despite his age, heavy winter coat dusted with snow. The man stopped beside the table and looked down at Hawk. "Military dog?" Garrett nodded carefully. "Retired." The man crouched slowly and let Hawk smell his hand first. Hawk accepted him immediately. That alone caught Garrett's attention. "Dog's got good judgment," the man said quietly. Then he looked back at Garrett. "Your uncle saved my barn during the wildfire back in 2009. Worked 36 hours straight beside the volunteer crews." Garrett blinked once. That didn't fit the version of Walter Boone he carried in his head. The old man extended his hand. "Name's Eli Mercer." Garrett shook it. Eli studied him for a moment. "You got his eyes," he said finally. Garrett looked away toward the snowy street outside. The town suddenly felt strange. Not hostile. Worse. familiar. As dusk settled over Blackwater Ridge, snow began falling again outside the diner windows. Garrett finished the last bite of pie in silence while Hawk rested beside the booth. For the first time in years, something dangerous stirred quietly inside him. Not anger, not fear, belonging. And that frightened him more than anything. Garrett left Clara's diner just after sunrise the next morning. Fresh snow blanketed Blackwater Ridge beneath a pale silver sky. The town looked quieter now, almost frozen in place beneath the mountains surrounding it. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys while snowplows crawled down Main Street, pushing heavy banks of ice aside. Hawk jumped into the truck first. The old dog immediately turned toward the windshield, alert again. Watching. Always watching. Garrett stood outside the truck for a long moment, with both hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Clara's words from the diner still echoed inside his head. His soldier. Not nephew. Not burden. Not mistake. His soldier. The phrase unsettled him more than anger ever could. For 30 years, Garrett had carried a simple truth like armor. Walter Boone didn't want him. Simple truths were easier to survive. Now that certainty had cracks in it, and Garrett didn't know what was waiting underneath. The old Ford groaned as it climbed north out of town, along a narrow mountain road lined with towering pine trees. Snow drifted heavily through the forest, while the tires crunched over packed ice. The deeper they drove into the mountains, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no sirens, no city noise, only endless forest. Garrett rolled down the window slightly despite the cold. The air smelled different here. Clean, sharp, pine sap and frozen earth. It reminded him painfully of places he used to love before war taught him how quickly peace could disappear. Hawk suddenly lifted his head higher. A low growl rumbled softly in his throat. Garrett glanced toward him. What is it? The Malinois stared into the woods beside the road, focused, tracking something. Garrett slowed the truck instinctively. The forest stood silent beneath heavy snow-covered branches. Nothing moved. Still, the uneasy feeling stayed with him. Military instinct. The sensation of being watched. After a few seconds, Hawk relaxed again, though not completely. Garrett drove on. 10 miles later, he finally saw the mailbox, or what remained of it. The wooden post leaned sideways beneath thick snowbanks while faded black letters barely remained visible beneath rust and weather damage. Boone Farm. The driveway beyond it stretched uphill through dense maple forests. Garrett stopped the truck at the entrance. For a moment, he simply stared upward through the falling snow. Then he slowly drove forward. The road twisted through the mountainside like an old scar cutting through the trees. Long, abandoned maple tubing hung between the trunks in sagging black lines, swaying gently in the winter wind. Like veins, like wires. The further they climbed, the stranger the place felt. Not dead exactly. Waiting. That was worse. Finally, the forest opened. Garrett's breath caught slightly. The Boone farm stood alone beneath the mountains. The farmhouse was larger than he expected, a weathered 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a wide, sagging porch buried beneath snowdrifts. One side of the roof had partially collapsed years ago. Several windows were boarded shut, while others stared black and empty toward the forest. Beyond the house sat a massive sugar house with a rusted metal chimney rising toward the gray sky. The entire property looked frozen in time, abandoned, forgotten, yet somehow still standing through sheer stubbornness. Garrett killed the engine. Silence immediately swallowed everything. No city noise, no traffic, only wind moving softly through the maple trees. Hawk jumped from the truck first. The dog immediately became tense. His ears stood upright while he slowly scanned the property. Garrett noticed it too. Tracks. Fresh boot prints in the snow near the barn. Not old. Recent. Very recent. Garrett crouched beside them. Large boots. Heavy tread. At least 2 people. Maybe more. The snow inside the impressions hadn't fully hardened yet. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. Garrett slowly stood again. Every muscle in his body tightened automatically. Years of SEAL training flooded back before he could stop it. Observe, track, assess threat. Hawk moved closer beside him, silent now. Garrett studied the tree line surrounding the property. Dense woods. Perfect cover. Perfect observation points. A bad place to be careless. He reached beneath the truck seat and removed the old combat knife he kept hidden there. Not much, but better than nothing. "You smell that too, huh?" he muttered quietly to Hawk. The dog's gaze remained fixed toward the forest. Garrett approached the farmhouse carefully. Snow creaked beneath his boots while the old porch groaned in protest as he climbed the steps. The front door stood slightly crooked in its frame, warped from decades of harsh winters. He unlocked it with the key Evelyn Price had given him. The hinges screamed softly as the door opened inward. Cold, stale air rolled out immediately. Dust, old wood, ash, and something faint beneath it all. Maple syrup. Garrett stepped inside slowly. The house sat frozen beneath decades of silence. Furniture remained exactly where it had been left. Old blankets covered chairs and tables like pale ghosts. Family photographs lined the walls beneath layers of dust. Hawk moved room to room carefully ahead of him, sniffing corners and doorways. The old hardwood floor creaked beneath Garrett's boots. He stopped inside the living room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Beside it sat an old leather armchair facing the windows overlooking the mountains. A folded wool blanket still rested neatly across one arm, like someone had only stepped away for a moment. Garrett swallowed hard unexpectedly. The room felt personal, occupied, not by a ghost, by memory. He forced himself deeper into the house. The kitchen remained cluttered with old mason jars and rusted cookware. A handwritten calendar still hung crookedly on the wall beside the refrigerator. 3 years old. Garrett traced his fingers across the faded handwriting. Walter's handwriting. He recognized it instantly. That realization unsettled him more than anything so far. The staircase groaned as Garrett climbed toward the second floor. The hallway upstairs remained narrow and dim beneath weak winter light filtering through dirty windows. One bedroom door stood partially open. Garrett pushed it wider slowly, then stopped cold. The room had been preserved, not abandoned. Preserved. Military books lined shelves along the walls. An old Navy recruitment poster hung near the window. Folded blankets sat neatly atop a made bed untouched by dust and covering one entire wall. Photographs. Garrett's stomach tightened instantly. Dozens of photographs. Him. Garrett at BUD/S graduation. Garrett during deployment ceremonies. Garrett standing beside younger SEAL teammates. Newspaper clippings. Magazine photos. Military articles. Even blurry long-distance photographs that looked secretly taken from crowds. Garrett stepped backward slowly. His pulse hammered hard now. "What the hell?" Hawk suddenly growled sharply from downstairs. Garrett spun instantly. The dog stood frozen near the front windows. watching outside. Garrett moved quickly downstairs and crouched beside him. Fresh tire tracks, deep black tracks cutting through the snow near the driveway entrance. A vehicle had just turned around outside the property. Watching the house, watching him. Garrett moved carefully toward the front porch and scanned the road. Nothing now, only drifting snow and endless trees. But someone had been there. He felt it. The same cold instinct that had kept him alive overseas whispered loudly inside him now. This farm wasn't abandoned. Not really. Someone had been coming here. Recently. Regularly. And whoever it was already knew Garrett had arrived. As the winter wind moved through the maple trees surrounding the farm, Hawk stepped protectively closer beside him. Then the dog stared once more toward the dark forest beyond the driveway, and growled. The sound rolled low through Hawk's chest like distant thunder. Garrett followed the dog's gaze toward the trees lining the property road. Snow drifted between the trunks, while evening shadows stretched longer across the frozen ground. Nothing moved. Still, every instinct Garrett possessed screamed the same warning. Someone was out there, watching. He rested one hand gently on Hawk's shoulder. "Inside," he murmured. The Malinois hesitated before finally backing toward the porch. Garrett scanned the woods one last time before stepping into the farmhouse and locking the front door behind them. The deadbolt clicked loudly through the silence. Not that it would stop anybody serious. The old house creaked constantly after sunset. Wind moved through gaps in the walls while tree branches scraped softly against the roof outside. Garrett lit a fire in the stone fireplace using chopped wood stacked neatly beside the hearth. Walter had prepared for winter before he died. That realization unsettled Garrett again. The old man had expected someone to return. Expected him. Hawk lay near the fire but refused to fully relax. Every few minutes the dog lifted his head toward the windows, listening. Garrett sat heavily in the old leather chair facing the flames. The photographs upstairs wouldn't leave his mind. 30 years of silence. 30 years believing he'd been erased from Walter Boone's life. Yet somebody had carefully collected every scrap of Garrett's existence. Graduation photos, deployment articles, pictures taken from a distance. The old man had followed his entire life. Why? Garrett rubbed tired hands across his face. Nothing about this place made sense. His eyes drifted toward the dark hallway leading deeper into the house, then toward the snow-covered windows, then finally toward the old shotgun mounted above the fireplace. Walter's shotgun. Garrett stood and removed it carefully from the hooks, heavy, well-maintained. He checked the action automatically. Loaded. That sent another cold ripple through him. Walter hadn't trusted this mountain either. Outside, snow continued falling steadily beneath deepening darkness. Hours passed slowly. Garrett heated canned stew on the wood stove while Hawk remained near the front windows watching the driveway. The old dog barely touched his food. That worried Garrett more than he admitted. Military working dogs learn to trust instinct before training. If Hawk felt danger nearby, Garrett listened. By 10 o'clock, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the mountains hard enough to shake the old farmhouse walls. Snow hammered against the windows while the forest beyond disappeared entirely into darkness. Garrett finally spread blankets near the fireplace. No chance he was sleeping upstairs tonight. Too exposed. Too many blind spots. Hawk settled beside him, but remained awake. The fire crackled softly. Garrett stared into the flames while old memories surfaced uninvited. Afghanistan. Night operations. Cold desert mountains beneath moonlight. Men depending on him. Men who died following him. His chest tightened suddenly. The sound came first, metal clanging violently somewhere outside. Garrett snapped upright instantly. Hawk exploded to his feet, barking hard toward the rear of the property. Another crash echoed through the storm. The sugar house. Garrett grabbed the shotgun immediately. Adrenaline flooded his system so fast, it almost felt good. Clean. Familiar. Years disappeared from his body all at once. Hawk rushed toward the back door. "Easy," Garrett whispered sharply. He killed the lantern beside the fireplace first. Darkness swallowed the room instantly, except for weak firelight behind them. Garrett moved toward the rear kitchen carefully, while Hawk paced silently ahead. Another metallic crash sounded through the storm. Someone was inside the sugar house. Garrett opened the back door slowly. Freezing wind slammed into them immediately. Snow whipped violently across the yard. The sugar house stood roughly 70 yards away, beyond drifting white darkness. One of its side doors hung partially open. Light flickered faintly inside. Flashlights. Garrett crouched low instinctively. 3 shapes moved inside the building. Maybe 4. Hard to tell through the storm. Hawk growled beside him. Garrett studied the property quickly. No visible vehicles near the driveway. That meant they parked somewhere hidden. Smart. Professional. Not random vandals. Garrett moved through the snow silently despite his age and stiff joints. Hawk stayed glued beside him like a shadow, closer now. Voices drifted faintly through the wind. "Check the back." "Old man hid it somewhere." Garrett froze. Not teenagers. Not thieves. They were searching for something specific. One flashlight beam swept suddenly toward the doorway. Garrett flattened instantly against the outer wall. Combat instincts took over completely now. Heart steady. Breathing controlled. Observe first. Strike second. Hawk remained perfectly still beside him. The dog remembered this life too. Inside the sugar house, old machinery loomed beneath darkness and drifting dust. Massive rusted evaporators sat beneath hanging chains, while maple equipment lined the walls like skeletons from another century. A heavy-set man in a black winter jacket kicked over wooden crates angrily. "There's nothing here," he snapped. Another voice answered from deeper inside the building. "Boss said Boone kept records." "Old man's dead." "Then find them before the nephew does." Garrett's eyes narrowed instantly. The nephew. They meant him. One of the intruders suddenly turned toward the doorway. Garrett reacted immediately. He slammed the side door inward hard enough to knock the man backward, while Hawk launched forward with terrifying speed. The Malinois hit another intruder square in the chest. Chaos exploded through the sugar house. "Dog! Move!" A flashlight shattered against concrete. Garrett drove his shoulder into a third man and sent him crashing across old metal equipment. Years of training moved through his body automatically, despite the pain in his knees and back. One attacker reached inside his coat. Garrett leveled the shotgun instantly. "Don't." The word cut through the building like steel. Everything froze for one sharp second. Then another man shouted from outside, "Go! Go!" The intruders bolted immediately. Hawk chased one toward the rear exit before Garrett called him back sharply. "Hawk!" The dog stopped instantly despite the adrenaline flooding through him. Outside, engines roared alive beyond the trees. Garrett rushed to the doorway, just in time to see dark headlights weaving down the mountain road through heavy snow. Black SUVs. 2 of them. Gone within seconds. Silence slowly returned to the sugar house except for Garrett's hard breathing. Hawk paced aggressively near the doorway, still keyed up. Garrett lowered the shotgun slowly. Then he noticed something. One of the intruders had dropped a flashlight during the struggle. Beside it lay a black leather glove. Garrett picked it up carefully. Expensive material. Corporate, not local. Then he noticed the logo embossed near the wrist. Iron Veil Development. Garrett stared at it while wind moaned through the old building. This wasn't about taxes. This wasn't about buying land. These men had broken into the property during a snowstorm, searching for hidden records before Garrett could find them. Whatever Walter Boone had been protecting all these years, Iron Veil was still terrified of it. Hawk suddenly moved deeper into the sugar house. The dog stopped near the massive evaporator machine at the center of the room. Then he sniffed the floor carefully. Once. Twice. His ears lifted sharply. Garrett stepped closer. What is it? Hawk pawed once at the old wooden planks beneath the machine, then growled softly again. Garrett looked down at the floorboards. Something about them seemed slightly uneven, recently disturbed. A strange, cold feeling crept slowly through his chest. The intruders hadn't found what they came for, but Hawk just might have. The old Malinois stood rigid beside the evaporator machine in the center of the sugar house, ears forward, nose pressed low toward the wooden floorboards. Snow blew through the partially open side door, while wind rattled the rusted chimney overhead. The building smelled of ash, old maple syrup, machine oil, and cold iron. Garrett approached slowly with the shotgun still clenched tightly in his hands. Hawk, he murmured. The dog scratched once against the floorboards, hard, then again. Garrett crouched beside him. The wood beneath the machine looked different now that he was closer. Faint scrape marks crossed the planks near one corner. Recent movement. Someone had shifted this machinery before. Recently. Garrett ran his fingers along the floor. One section flexed slightly beneath pressure. His pulse quickened. The intruders hadn't come here randomly. They knew something was hidden beneath the sugar house, and Walter Boone had spent years protecting it. Garrett glanced once toward the storm outside. The black SUVs were gone, but they would come back. He felt certain of that. Hawk, move! The Malinois stepped aside reluctantly, while Garrett searched nearby shelves until he found a rusted pry bar hanging beside old sap buckets. The evaporator machine weighed several thousand pounds, but years of neglect had loosened its bolts from the floor. Garrett strained against the metal frame until it shifted several inches with a shriek of rusted steel. Dust exploded into the cold air. Beneath the machine, hidden carefully between the floorboards, sat a narrow iron ring almost completely concealed by dirt and soot. Garrett stared at it silently. A hatch. His heartbeat thudded heavily now. Hawk stood beside him perfectly still, watching, waiting. Garrett slid the pry bar beneath the hatch and pulled upward hard. At first nothing moved. Then the old wood suddenly gave way with a cracking groan. A wave of freezing stale air rose from the darkness below. Garrett stepped backward instinctively. A hidden staircase descended beneath the sugar house into complete blackness. The beam from Garrett's flashlight cut through drifting dust as he slowly aimed it downward. Concrete walls, metal pipes, old wiring, not some farmer's storm cellar. This looked military, very military. Garrett's stomach tightened. What the hell were you into, Walter? Hawk descended first without hesitation. The dog disappeared silently into the darkness below. Garrett followed carefully with the shotgun raised. The stairs ended inside a long underground corridor enforced with aging concrete and steel support beams. Old electrical conduits lined the ceiling overhead. Rusted ventilation fans sat motionless against the walls. Cold War architecture. Garrett recognized it immediately from old overseas bunkers he'd seen during joint operations years ago. Somebody had built this place for survival. The underground room opened wider ahead. Garrett's flashlight swept slowly across the space. Metal shelves, military crates, radio equipment, fuel drums, maps pinned across walls, and directly in the center of the bunker sat 4 large green military lockboxes, perfectly preserved. His breath fogged in the freezing air. Hawk moved carefully through the room, sniffing everything. Garrett approached the nearest crate slowly. U.S. military markings remained faintly visible beneath old paint. Jesus. He opened the first lockbox carefully. Inside sat tightly bundled stacks of $100 bills sealed in waterproof plastic. Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. Garrett stared in disbelief. The second crate contained old radio equipment and encrypted military communication gear unlike anything a maple farmer should possess. The third held documents, hundreds of documents, maps, property records, photographs, corporate filings, and newspaper clippings involving Iron Vale development dating back almost 30 years. Garrett's pulse accelerated harder as he flipped through them. Illegal land acquisitions, shell companies, missing veteran reports, mining surveys, environmental violations buried beneath legal settlements. The deeper he looked, the worse it became. Walter Boone hadn't simply been fighting developers. He'd been documenting them, building a case. Garrett suddenly understood why armed men had broken into the sugar house during a blizzard. Then his flashlight landed on the fourth crate. Unlike the others, this one carried no military markings. Only a handwritten label taped carefully across the lid. For Garrett. The words hit him harder than he expected. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he slowly opened the crate. Inside sat dozens of sealed envelopes bundled neatly together with twine. Cassette tapes, photographs, a leather journal, and one old revolver wrapped carefully inside cloth. Everything arranged with deliberate care, like Walter had prepared this moment years before it happened. Garrett picked up the top envelope slowly. The handwriting instantly punched through him. Walter's, still strong despite age. Garrett, if you found this place, it means 2 things. First, I'm gone. Second, they finally know you came home. Garrett swallowed hard. Hawk settled quietly beside him, while the underground bunker hummed with silence. He opened the letter carefully. The paper trembled slightly in his rough hands. I don't expect forgiveness from you. Truthfully, I never earned it. But before you decide what kind of man I was, you deserve to know what happened to your family. Garrett sat slowly on an old metal chair beside the crate. Outside, wind moaned faintly through distant ventilation shafts above them. The bunker felt untouched by time, frozen, waiting. He continued reading. Your father discovered something during his final deployment overseas. Things he should never have seen. Things connected to defense contractors operating through private military companies. Men making fortunes by burying soldiers and secrets together. Garrett's chest tightened immediately. His father had been Army Special Forces, killed during what the government officially called a training accident. Walter's letter continued. Your father tried bringing evidence home. 2 months later, his convoy exploded outside Kandahar. The military blamed insurgents. That was a lie. Garrett stared at the page. Cold spread slowly through his body. No, that wasn't possible. His mother died in a car accident less than a year later. Another official report. Another closed investigation. Walter's handwriting grew shakier further down the page. After your mother died, men began coming around, asking questions about you. Questions no child should ever be connected to. I realized then they weren't done cleaning up loose ends. Garrett's breathing slowed dangerously. The bunker suddenly felt smaller, tighter. Hawk pressed gently against his leg. Walter's words blurred slightly as Garrett continued. I couldn't protect you openly, not without putting a target on your back. So I made the hardest choice of my life. Garrett stopped breathing completely for a second. I let you hate me, because hatred was safer than burying you. The sentence shattered something inside him. For 30 years, Garrett had carried abandonment like a wound that never healed. The old man threw me away. That belief had shaped every broken thing in his life. Every wall, every failed relationship, every lonely year after war hollowed him out. Now the truth underneath it cracked open beneath his feet. Walter hadn't pushed him away because he didn't care. He pushed him away because he did. Garrett lowered the letter slowly. The underground room blurred around him. Hawk moved closer immediately and rested his head against Garrett's knee. The old soldier finally broke. Not loudly, no screaming, no dramatic collapse. Just silent grief pouring out of a man who'd spent decades holding himself together through sheer force alone. Garrett bowed his head while tears hit the old paper in his hands. All those years, all that hatred, all that pain. And somewhere out there, an old man had been protecting him from the shadows the entire time. The bunker remained silent except for Garrett's uneven breathing and the distant groaning of winter wind far above. After several minutes, Garrett finally looked up again. His eyes drifted toward the stacks of evidence surrounding him, toward the maps, the records, the hidden cache. Walter Boone hadn't been hiding from the world. He'd been preparing for war, and somehow, that war had just become Garrett's. The underground bunker sat in complete silence except for the faint hum of old ventilation ducts and the soft crackle of snow hitting the sugar house roof far above. Garrett remained seated at the metal table with Walter Boone's letter trembling slightly in his hands. Hawk rested beside him, one paw stretched across Garrett's boot, as if anchoring him to the ground. The old soldier stared at the final lines again. Hatred was safer than burying you. For 30 years, Garrett had built his identity around abandonment. His father died overseas. His mother died soon after. And Walter Boone, the last blood family he had left, cut him loose without explanation. That wound had shaped everything afterward. Every deployment, every failed marriage, every night spent alone after coming home from war. If nobody wanted you, eventually you stopped expecting love from the world. It made survival easier. Now that certainty was collapsing beneath him. Garrett rubbed both hands hard across his face and forced himself to breathe steadily. The bunker walls suddenly felt too close, too heavy. Combat memories stirred dangerously beneath the surface. Confusion, noise, panic. He recognized the signs immediately. Hawk did too. The Malinois climbed halfway into Garrett's lap and pressed firmly against his chest until the spiral slowed. Garrett closed his eyes briefly. "Good boy," he whispered hoarsely. The dog stayed there until Garrett's breathing steadied again. Finally, Garrett reached for the old cassette recorder sitting inside the crate. A yellowed label covered one side. For Garrett. "Play this first." His fingers hesitated above the buttons. Then he pressed play. Static crackled softly through the bunker. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then an older man's gravelly voice filled the room. Garrett. The single word hit like a punch to the chest. Walter Boone. Older. Tired. But unmistakably strong. If you're hearing this, then I didn't make it long enough to explain things face to face. A pause followed. Garrett could hear the old man breathing unevenly into the recorder. That's my fault, Walter continued quietly. Most of this mess is. Garrett stared down at the cassette player while Hawk settled back beside his chair. I imagine you spent a long time hating me, Walter said. Garrett swallowed hard. Yes, he whispered into the silence. The recording continued. You deserved better than silence, better than disappearing letters and unanswered questions. Another long pause. But I need you to understand something before anything else. Static hissed softly. I never stopped watching over you. Garrett shut his eyes tightly. The room blurred again. Walter's voice continued through the bunker. Your father found documents during his final deployment. Records connected to military contractors moving weapons and personnel through unofficial channels overseas. Garrett listened silently. Some of those men were powerful enough to bury investigations before they started. When your father realized what he'd uncovered, he tried reporting it. The tape crackled. 3 weeks later, his convoy exploded. Garrett clenched both fists hard. Afghanistan. Convoy explosion. Official report. Insurgent ambush. He remembered the folded flag handed to his mother, the military officers standing stiffly beside her, the empty coffin. Walter's breathing roughened slightly on the tape. Your mother knew something was wrong too. She wanted to reopen the investigation. Then her brakes failed coming down Route 17 during winter. Garrett's blood ran cold. Not accident. Never accident. The bunker suddenly felt darker somehow. Walter continued. I started noticing people around town after that. Strange vehicles. Men asking questions about you. Garrett remembered flashes now. Black sedans parked near school. Adults whispering when they thought he couldn't hear. The old man on the tape sighed heavily. You were only 12 years old. The words cracked slightly. I knew if they believed you might someday learn what your father discovered. You'd never be safe. Garrett looked away toward the bunker wall. His chest hurt. Actual physical pain pressing beneath his ribs. I thought if I cut ties publicly, they'd lose interest, Walter said quietly. I made sure everyone believed we'd become estranged. Garrett remembered that too. The screaming arguments. Walter forcing him into the truck. The social worker office. The old man never once looking back as he walked away. Garrett had replayed that memory thousands of times during sleepless nights. The tape hissed softly again. You need to understand something, son. Garrett froze. Son. Nobody had called him that in years. Walking away from you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Garrett's eyes burned. I used every favor I had to keep track of you afterward, Walter continued. I monitored your schools, your military records, your deployments. Garrett remembered the strange anonymous donations during SEAL training, the unexplained care packages overseas, the scholarship money that appeared after his wife died. Walter. All of it had been Walter. The old man's voice softened further. When you graduated BUD/S, I drove to Coronado just to watch from the crowd. Garrett's head snapped upward slightly. What? I stood 3 rows back near the fence line. You looked so much like your father that day it nearly stopped my heart. Garrett remembered seeing an older man standing far away beyond the crowd. Flannel jacket, baseball cap. He never recognized him. Tears rolled silently down Garrett's face now. "I wanted to hug you," Walter admitted, "but I was afraid someone might still be watching." The bunker felt unbearably quiet. Walter cleared his throat weakly on the tape. "I know what war does to men, Garrett. I saw it happen to your father. Then later I watched it happen to you from a distance." The old man coughed hard. "Every article I saved, every deployment clipping, every photograph, I kept because they reminded me you were still alive." Garrett looked toward the stacks of carefully preserved photos upstairs in the farmhouse. Not obsession. Love. Lonely, hidden love. The tape recorder clicked softly as Walter shifted position. "This farm became the last safe place left connected to your family," he continued. "Iron Vale thinks there's something valuable buried beneath this mountain." Garrett glanced around the bunker slowly. "They're right." Another pause. "But what matters most isn't the tunnels or the records." Walter's voice weakened further. "It's you." Garrett lowered his head. "I built all of this so one day you'd have somewhere to come home to after the war finally ended." The sentence shattered him completely. Garrett bowed forward, elbows against his knees, while years of buried grief finally broke loose inside him. Not loud, not dramatic, just deep, exhausted sorrow pouring from a man who had spent decades surviving instead of living. Hawk immediately moved closer and rested his head against Garrett's shoulder. The old dog stayed perfectly still while Garrett quietly cried in the dim underground bunker. Outside, winter storms battered the mountain above them. But down here beneath the sugar house, another storm was finally ending. After several long minutes, Garrett wiped his face roughly and forced himself upright again. The tape still played. Walter's breathing sounded shallow now. "There's cash stored in the crates," he said. "Enough to pay the back taxes immediately." Garrett looked toward the sealed bundles stacked nearby. "Do not trust Iron Vale," Walter warned. "The taxes were intentional." Garrett frowned. "What?" "I stopped paying them years ago to delay foreclosure proceedings. Every lawsuit forced them into court instead of taking the land quietly." The old man coughed again. "I bought time the only way I knew how." Garrett stared around the bunker in disbelief. Walter Boone hadn't become reckless in old age. He'd been fighting a silent war, alone. "For years I hoped they'd eventually give up," Walter continued weakly. "Instead, they grew more desperate." The tape crackled loudly for a second. "If you choose to leave, I understand. Nobody would blame you." Garrett listened carefully now. "But if you stay, if you decide this place is worth defending, then you need to know the truth." A long silence followed. Then Walter's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "There are tunnels beneath this mountain older than the farm itself." Garrett's eyes narrowed instantly. "Cold War communication tunnels," Walter said. "Built during the 1960s under defense contracts tied to old missile tracking systems." Garrett slowly looked around the bunker again. Everything suddenly made horrifying sense. Iron Vale didn't want farmland. They wanted whatever sat beneath it. The recording neared its end. "I'm sorry for the years you lost because of me," Walter said softly, "but I would make the same choice again if it meant keeping you alive." Garrett's throat tightened painfully. "One day you'll understand something war teaches every man eventually." The tape crackled one final time. "Sometimes love looks cruel from the outside." Then silence. The recorder clicked softly as the tape ended. Garrett sat motionless for a long time afterward. Snow continued falling somewhere high above the bunker. Hawk remained beside him. And for the first time since arriving in Vermont, Garrett Boone no longer felt abandoned. That realization should have brought peace. Instead, it brought anger. Not wild anger, not reckless anger. Something colder, cleaner, the kind that settled deep in a soldier's chest and stayed there. Garrett sat alone in the underground bunker long after the cassette tape ended. The dim lantern beside him cast weak shadows across concrete walls lined with old military maps and classified documents. Walter Boone had spent decades fighting a silent war. Alone. And in the end, the old man died guarding it. Garrett looked toward the stacks of evidence spread across the metal table. Property records, financial transfers, shell corporations tied to Iron Vale Development, military contractor names, some of them familiar. Too familiar. Garrett's stomach tightened when he recognized one logo stamped across an old folder. Argos Defense Solutions, a private military contractor Garrett had encountered during overseas operations years earlier. They handled security logistics, at least officially. Unofficially, rumors followed them everywhere. Weapons trafficking, disappeared civilians, government contracts that somehow survived scandal after scandal. Walter hadn't uncovered a local land dispute. He'd stumbled into something far larger. Hawk suddenly lifted his head toward the bunker stairs. Garrett immediately froze. Silence. Then, a faint buzzing sound outside. Low, mechanical. Garrett moved instantly, killing the lantern. Darkness swallowed the bunker. The buzzing grew louder overhead. Hawk growled softly. Drone. Garrett recognized the sound immediately. He climbed the bunker stairs slowly and eased the sugar house hatch open just enough to look outside. Snow still covered the mountains beneath a dark gray morning sky. And high above the property, a black quadcopter drone hovered silently near the tree line. Watching the farm. Watching him. Garrett's jaw tightened hard. Iron Vale wasted no time. The drone drifted slowly toward the farmhouse roof before circling again. Professional equipment, long-range camera rig, not hobby gear. Garrett lowered the hatch carefully. This isn't over, buddy, he muttered quietly to Hawk. The dog remained tense beside him. Neither of them trusted the mountain anymore. By noon, Garrett drove into Blackwater Ridge carrying one of the cash bundles hidden inside an old duffel bag beneath his coat. Snowbanks lined the roads while church bells echoed faintly through town. People looked up as his truck rolled down Main Street. Word traveled fast in places like this, especially after armed men showed up on your property during a storm. Garrett parked outside the county municipal building and sat motionless behind the wheel for several seconds. He hated government buildings, always had. Too many memories, too many folded flags. Hawk rested quietly in the passenger seat, while Garrett finally stepped outside into the freezing air. Inside, the tax office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. A tired woman with silver hair sat behind the counter reading glasses low on her nose. She looked up, then blinked in surprise. Garrett Boone? He frowned slightly. You know me? Whole town knows you by now. That unsettled him immediately. The woman stood slowly. Your uncle talked about you often. Garrett looked away, still getting used to hearing that. I'm here about the back taxes on the Boone property, he said carefully. The woman's expression changed. Concern, sympathy, maybe even warning. That's a substantial amount. I know. Garrett placed the certified bank envelope on the counter. The woman opened it slowly, then stared. Her eyes widened behind the glasses. You're paying all of it? Yes. Silence filled the small office. The woman looked back up at him carefully. You understand this clears the foreclosure process entirely? That's the idea. She studied him for another long moment, then lowered her voice. Iron Veil isn't going to like this. Garrett's expression hardened slightly. They'll survive the disappointment. The woman almost smiled at that. Almost. 3 signatures later, the debt that had haunted the Boone farm for years officially disappeared. The county stamp hit the paperwork with a loud final thud. Paid in full. Garrett stared at the words longer than he expected. Something shifted inside him. Not victory. Responsibility. The mountain belonged to him now. Entirely. And that meant the danger belonged to him too. As Garrett exited the building, a familiar black SUV sat parked across the street. Engine running. Windows tinted dark. Nathan Crowley leaned casually against the passenger door beneath falling snow. Expensive charcoal coat. Perfect haircut. Smile too polished to trust. Corporate predator dressed like a gentleman. Garrett immediately noticed 2 additional men inside the SUV watching him carefully. Crowley smiled wider as Garrett approached. Mr. Boone. Garrett stopped several feet away. Following me now? Crowley ignored the question. I heard you paid the taxes. News travels fast. In a town this small? Very. Garrett noticed Hawk growling softly inside the truck behind him. Crowley glanced toward the dog. That animal seems protective. He's smarter than most people. Crowley chuckled lightly. Then his expression cooled. You're making a mistake, Garrett. The use of his first name instantly irritated him. Crowley stepped closer. You're sitting on land worth a fortune to the right buyers. It's not for sale. You haven't even heard the updated offer. I don't need to. Crowley studied him carefully now. No more fake warmth. You know, he said quietly, your uncle spent years destroying himself over this property. Garrett's jaw tightened. Funny thing about stubborn men, Crowley continued. They usually leave behind nothing but trouble. Garrett stepped closer too. Snow drifted between them. You broke into my sugar house. Crowley's smile never moved. I have no idea what you're talking about. Your employee dropped his glove. That finally caused the smallest crack in the lawyer's expression. Only a flicker. But Garrett saw it. SEAL instincts. Always reading weakness. Crowley recovered quickly. You're a veteran, Garrett. So am I, technically. Garrett doubted that immediately. Which means you understand when a battle can't be won. Garrett looked toward the mountains surrounding Blackwater Ridge, then back at Crowley. I spent 26 years fighting in places people said couldn't be won. Crowley's voice hardened now. This land isn't important enough to die for. Garrett took one slow step closer. Then why are your people willing to kill for it? Silence. Cold wind moved through the street. Crowley stared at him for several seconds. Then he smiled again. But there was no warmth left in it now. Careful, Mr. Boone. He nodded toward Garrett's truck. Bad things happen in mountain winters, especially to old dogs. The threat landed exactly how Crowley intended. Hawk exploded into furious barking inside the truck. Garrett's eyes went flat instantly. Dangerous flat. The kind of look only combat veterans carried. For one long second, Crowley seemed to realize he may have crossed a line. Garrett spoke quietly. Mention my dog again. His voice barely rose above the falling snow. And this conversation ends differently. Crowley held his gaze another moment before stepping back. The corporate smile returned again like a mask. Think carefully about your future. Then he climbed into the SUV. The black vehicle disappeared down Main Street moments later beneath swirling snow. Garrett stood motionless, watching it go. Rage simmered beneath his skin now. Not fear, not uncertainty. War. The war Walter Boone spent decades fighting had finally stepped into the open. And Garrett understood something very clearly now. Iron Vale wasn't afraid of the farm. They were afraid of what remained hidden beneath it. That evening, Garrett drove back toward the mountain while snow darkened the roads beneath another incoming storm. Halfway up the property road, Hawk suddenly growled sharply again. Garrett slammed the brakes. Fresh damage stretched across the maple lines running through the trees. Dozens of collection tubes had been sliced open deliberately. Sap containers smashed. Metal taps ripped from trunks. Sabotage. Garrett stepped from the truck slowly while icy wind tore through the forest. The mountain suddenly felt hostile now, no longer waiting, attacking. He stared across the damaged maple grove beneath fading evening light. Walter had spent years protecting this place alone. Now Garrett finally understood why, and deep beneath the growing anger inside him, something else returned too. Purpose. Garrett stood among the damaged maple lines while snow drifted silently through the darkening forest. The cut tubing swayed gently in the wind, like severed veins hanging between the trees. Sap buckets lay overturned in the snow. Metal taps had been ripped violently from trunks and scattered across the grove. This wasn't vandalism. It was a message. Leave. Garrett crouched beside one of the damaged trees and picked up a broken tap buried in snow. His jaw tightened. Walter Boone spent years building this operation. Every tree tapped by hand. Every line maintained through brutal Vermont winters, and Iron Vale was tearing it apart piece by piece. Hawk moved carefully through the grove, sniffing the ground beneath fading evening light. The old Malinois suddenly stopped near the edge of the woods. Low growl. Garrett followed the dog's stare toward the dark tree line. Nothing visible. But that feeling returned again. Eyes watching from somewhere beyond the forest. Garrett slowly stood. Not tonight, he muttered quietly. Back at the farmhouse, Garrett immediately got to work. Military habits returned fast once purpose entered the equation. He checked every door and window, mapped blind spots around the property, positioned old motion lanterns near the barn and sugar house. The shotgun never left arm's reach. Hawk followed him silently through every room. Outside, another storm gathered over the mountains. Heavy clouds rolled across the moon while wind pushed harder through the trees. Garrett barely noticed the cold anymore. For the first time in years, his mind felt focused instead of drifting. Mission. Protect the farm. Protect the evidence. Protect Hawk. Simple. Around midnight, the power suddenly died. The farmhouse went completely black. Garrett froze instantly. Not weather. The storm hadn't reached them yet. Someone cut the electricity. Hawk erupted into barking near the front windows. Garrett grabbed the shotgun and moved low through the dark house. Then came the smell, smoke. His pulse exploded. The sugar house. Garrett rushed onto the porch. Orange firelight flickered violently through the storm beyond the trees. Damn it! The sugar house roof had caught fire. Flames climbed quickly up one side of the old wooden structure, while thick smoke poured into the snowy night sky. 3 shadowy figures moved near the building. Garrett sprinted toward them without hesitation. Hawk charged ahead like a missile through the snow. One of the intruders spotted Garrett first. Move! The men scattered instantly across the property. Garrett fired one warning blast into the air. The explosion echoed violently through the mountains. Hawk tackled one intruder near the side wall of the sugar house, dragging the man hard into the snow. Another figure rushed from behind carrying a metal pipe. Garrett slammed into him shoulder first before the strike landed. Both men crashed into the frozen ground. Years vanished again. Combat training took over completely. Garrett drove an elbow hard into the attacker's ribs and ripped the pipe away. The man scrambled backward through the snow and ran toward the trees. Then Garrett heard it. A gunshot. Sharp. Violent. Too close. Hawk yelped. The sound ripped through Garrett's chest like a blade. "Hawk!" The Malinois collapsed near the burning sugar house, struggling to stand, while dark blood spread quickly across the snow beneath him. Everything inside Garrett went cold. One of the masked men raised the handgun again. Garrett moved before thinking. He slammed the attacker against the side of the sugar house hard enough to send the weapon flying into the snow. The man broke free and disappeared into the storm alongside the others. SUV engines roared alive somewhere beyond the trees seconds later. Then they were gone, leaving only fire, smoke, and Hawk bleeding in the snow. Garrett dropped beside the dog instantly. "No, no, no, no." The bullet had passed through Hawk's shoulder. Blood soaked the thick fur beneath him. The old Malinois tried to rise anyway, still trying to protect him. "Easy, buddy," Garrett whispered shakily. Hawk whined softly, but kept his eyes locked on Garrett's face. The sugar house groaned loudly behind them as flames spread higher along the roof. Garrett tore off his flannel overshirt and pressed it hard against the wound. Blood soaked through immediately. Panic clawed hard at his chest now. Not combat panic. Worse. Personal. The same helpless terror he felt watching teammates die overseas. Not again. Not Hawk. The dog had survived Afghanistan. Explosions, gunfire, years of nightmares. Garrett refused to lose him here on a frozen mountain to corporate thugs. He scooped Hawk carefully into his arms, despite the pain shooting through his own body. The Malinois weighed nearly 70 pounds, but adrenaline erased exhaustion completely. Garrett carried him through the blizzard toward the truck, while smoke rolled across the property behind them. The sugar house roof partially collapsed with a shower of sparks as he drove away. Black smoke rose into the mountains behind them like a funeral signal. Garrett gripped the steering wheel one-handed, while the other stayed pressed against Hawk's wound. Blood covered the passenger seat. "Stay with me," Garrett whispered repeatedly. Hawk's breathing came shallow now. The truck fishtailed twice on the icy road, descending toward Blackwater Ridge. Garrett ignored it. Every second mattered. By the time the diner lights appeared through the storm, Garrett's hands were shaking badly. He slammed the truck to a stop outside Clara's diner and burst through the doors carrying Hawk in his arms. The entire room froze. "Oh my God," Clara gasped. "Vet!" Garrett barked urgently. "Now!" Within seconds, the small diner exploded into motion. Someone grabbed blankets. Someone else called the town veterinarian. Eli Mercer appeared from the back room immediately. "Lay him here." Garrett lowered Hawk carefully onto two tables shoved together near the kitchen. The dog's breathing weakened further. Blood stained everything. Clara pressed clean towels into Garrett's hands, while another man rushed outside for medical supplies. The entire diner moved like a family responding to crisis without needing instructions. Garrett barely noticed his own hands trembling violently now. A memory surged suddenly. Another teammate bleeding out overseas. Another desperate attempt to stop blood loss. The room tilted hard around him. Clara grabbed his arm immediately. "Garrett." Her voice grounded him. "Stay with us. He forced air back into his lungs. The veterinarian arrived 10 minutes later, wearing snow boots and carrying emergency equipment. Dr. Hannah Wells looked barely 40 but moved with calm authority. "Shepherd mix?" she asked quickly. "Belgian Malinois," Garrett answered hoarsely. She examined the wound carefully, while Hawk remained frighteningly still. "The bullet passed through," Hannah said finally. "That's good news." Garrett closed his eyes briefly in relief. "But he's lost a lot of blood." The old dog opened his eyes weakly at Garrett's voice. Garrett rested a hand gently against Hawk's neck. "You're all right, buddy," he whispered. Outside, snow continued falling heavily beyond the diner windows, while sirens echoed faintly somewhere up the mountain. Fire crews heading toward the Boone farm. Clara stood beside Garrett quietly. "Walter helped half this town survive hard winters," she said softly. "Nobody's gonna let them do this to you." Garrett looked around the diner. Every table was occupied now by people from town. Farmers, mechanics, old veterans, people he barely knew. Yet nobody left. Nobody turned away. They brought coffee, bandages, tools, offers to help repair the farm. One older man even placed an old hunting rifle beside Garrett's chair without saying a word. The message was clear. Blackwater Ridge had chosen a side, and for the first time since returning from war, Garrett Boone realized he wasn't fighting alone anymore. The storm lasted through the rest of the night. Snow hammered the windows of Clara's diner, while exhausted volunteers drifted in and out carrying coffee, blankets, and updates from the mountain. The fire crews managed to save most of the farmhouse, but the sugar house roof was badly damaged. Part of the western wall collapsed inward. Garrett listened quietly while sitting beside Hawk near the back room where Dr. Hannah Wells worked beneath warm yellow lights. The old Malinois lay sedated on a thick blanket, his shoulders shaved and stitched carefully beneath layers of clean bandages. Every few minutes, Garrett checked to make sure Hawk's chest was still rising. "Doctor." Wells finally stepped out from the treatment room shortly before dawn. "He's stable." Garrett exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time in hours. "But he needs rest," Hannah continued. "That shoulder's going to take time." Garrett nodded. "I can handle that." She studied him carefully. "You should probably let somebody look at your ribs, too." Garrett glanced down at the dark bruising spreading beneath his flannel shirt. "I've had worse." "That's not the same thing as being fine." The sentence lingered awkwardly between them. Garrett wasn't used to people noticing when he hurt. Most veterans weren't. Hannah softened slightly. "You don't always have to carry everything alone, Garrett." He looked away first. Outside, dawn slowly brightened the mountains beyond the diner windows. Snow-covered rooftops glowed pale blue beneath the fading storm, while smoke rose from chimneys across Blackwater Ridge. The town looked peaceful, but Garrett knew better now. Wars rarely looked dangerous from a distance. Clara handed him a fresh cup of coffee as he sat near Hawk's blanket. "You should get some sleep." Garrett shook his head. "Can't." "You haven't slept properly since you got here." "Haven't slept properly since 2012. Clara didn't know how to answer that. Neither did he. The diner slowly emptied as morning settled over town. People returned to jobs and farms after promising to help repair the Boone property later that week. Sheriff Miles Granger arrived just after sunrise. Tall, gray-haired, broad shoulders that still carried traces of military posture despite age. The sheriff removed his snow-covered hat slowly as he entered the diner. His eyes immediately found Garrett. Then Hawk. "Heard about the fire." Garrett nodded once. Sheriff Granger crouched beside the injured Malinois. "That dog saved your life." "Yes." The sheriff studied Hawk quietly for several seconds before standing again. I tracked the SUV tire prints from your property road. Garrett looked up sharply. And? They vanished near Route 12. Granger's jaw tightened slightly. Professional drivers knew what they were doing. Garrett wasn't surprised. The sheriff lowered his voice. You need to understand something about Iron Vale. Garrett leaned back carefully in the chair. They own people around here. Meaning? County commissioners, state inspectors, half the zoning board. Granger glanced toward the windows. They donate money everywhere, make promises, threaten lawsuits. Garrett took a slow sip of coffee. And you? The sheriff met his eyes directly. I spent 14 months in Fallujah. He paused. I know what organized intimidation looks like. Something passed silently between the two veterans then. Recognition. Garrett nodded once. Granger continued quietly. Walter Boone came to me twice before he died. That got Garrett's full attention. He said if anything happened to him, the sheriff hesitated briefly, you'd eventually come home. Garrett looked away toward the snow-covered mountains outside. Still strange hearing that word. Home. He left something with me too, Granger added. The sheriff removed a sealed envelope from inside his coat. Garrett recognized Walter's handwriting immediately. The sight of it still hit him hard every time. Walter said not to give this to you unless Iron Vale escalated. Garrett took the envelope carefully. They escalated. Granger nodded grimly. I'd say burning your sugar house qualifies. The sheriff left shortly afterward, promising increased patrols around the property. Garrett watched him disappear through the diner windows before finally opening the envelope. Inside sat another handwritten letter and several old photographs. One photo stopped him cold instantly. Garrett as a young SEAL standing beside a helicopter overseas, taken from far away through a telephoto lens. Walter must have traveled thousands of miles just to see him alive. Another photograph showed Garrett sitting alone outside a military hospital after his wife's funeral years earlier. Garrett barely remembered that day, but Walter had been there, watching from a distance, never abandoning him, never truly leaving. Garrett unfolded the letter slowly. Garrett, by the time you read this, Iron Vale will have shown you who they really are. I'm sorry for that. But if they've attacked openly, it means they're running out of time. Garrett frowned slightly. The letter continued. There's more beneath this mountain than communication tunnels. Iron Vale discovered mineral surveys years ago tied to rare earth deposits buried near the old Cold War network. Garrett's eyes narrowed. Rare earth minerals, defense contracts, military communication systems. Suddenly the desperation made more sense. Walter's handwriting grew shakier further down the page. They don't just want the land. They want control of everything hidden beneath it. Garrett continued reading carefully. I spent years collecting records because I knew someday somebody would need proof, not just for the farm, for the men they buried along the way. Garrett's pulse slowed dangerously. Buried? He turned the page quickly. Some veterans connected to Argos Defense disappeared after refusing illegal overseas operations. Others came home broken and died under suspicious circumstances. Iron Vale purchased land connected to several of those investigations afterward. Garrett stared at the page. His stomach twisted hard. This wasn't corporate greed anymore. It was something darker. Walter's final lines looked rushed. If you choose to fight, don't do it alone. Blackwater Ridge remembers who stood beside them during hard winters. Trust the town. They're stronger than they know. Garrett lowered the letter slowly. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Golden light spilled across the snowy streets of Blackwater Ridge. Hawk stirred weakly beside him. Garrett immediately crouched down. The Malinois blinked slowly, still groggy from medication. "There he is," Garrett whispered softly. Hawk tried to rise instantly despite the injury. Garrett rested a hand gently against his chest. "Easy." The dog whined quietly, but relaxed again once Garrett stayed close. Clara approached carrying a plate of eggs and toast. "You need food." Garrett accepted it reluctantly. "You know," Clara said carefully, "Walter used to leave town every few months without telling anybody where he went." Garrett looked up. "What for?" "He never said." Clara glanced toward the old photographs beside Garrett's chair. "Now I think maybe he was checking on you." Garrett stared down at the images again. Walter Boone standing hidden in crowds, watching graduations, military ceremonies, funerals. A lonely old man tracking the life of the only family he had left. The grief hit differently now. Not abandonment. Sacrifice. The kind older generations carried quietly because they believed pain was easier to survive alone. Garrett rubbed a hand slowly across Hawk's neck. For years, he believed nobody had come looking for him after war hollowed him out. But Walter had. In every way he safely could. Outside, church bells rang softly across Blackwater Ridge, while townspeople began clearing snow from sidewalks beneath bright winter sunlight. And for the first time in decades, Garrett Boone no longer felt like a man drifting through the world without roots. He felt chosen, and that made him dangerous. 3 weeks after the fire, winter slowly began loosening its grip on Blackwater Ridge. Snow still covered the mountains, but the hard, killing cold had softened into dripping icicles and muddy roadside slush. Thin streams of meltwater trickled beneath frozen maple trees, while pale sunlight finally reached the valley longer each afternoon. The Boone farm looked wounded. The sugar house roof remained partially collapsed beneath blackened beams. Smoke stains scarred the remaining walls, and temporary tarps snapped loudly in the mountain wind. But the place was alive again. Volunteers from town arrived almost daily. Eli Mercer rebuilt sections of the porch with 2 retired carpenters from the next county over. Clara brought food every evening. Sheriff Granger quietly arranged extra patrols near the mountain road. Even teenagers from town showed up carrying lumber and tools after school. Walter Boone had spent decades helping people survive hard winters. Now Blackwater Ridge was returning the favor. Garrett worked beside them every day. The physical labor helped, repairing fences, replacing maple lines, clearing burned debris from the sugar house. Simple tasks kept his mind from drifting into old combat memories. At night, though, the nightmares still came. Some nights he woke gripping the shotgun beside the bed, while sweat soaked through his shirt. Other nights he heard explosions that weren't there. Hawk always grounded him before the panic spiraled too far. The old Malinois still limped from the gunshot wound, but his strength slowly returned each day. He followed Garrett everywhere across the property, refusing to leave his side for even a moment. One cold morning, Garrett stood near the damaged sugar house reviewing Walter's documents when Sheriff Granger's truck rolled up the driveway. The sheriff climbed out, looking grim. "That bad?" Garrett asked immediately. Granger handed him an official county notice. Emergency zoning hearing, Blackwater Ridge Municipal Hall. Garrett's jaw tightened as he scanned the document. Iron Vale Development had filed emergency environmental and safety complaints against the Boone property. Fire hazards, structural instability, abandoned military infrastructure beneath the land. Garrett looked up sharply. They know about the tunnels. They know enough, Granger replied. The sheriff removed his gloves slowly. They're pushing for county seizure authority. Garrett's stomach hardened instantly. If the board rules against you, Granger continued quietly, they can force temporary state control of the property until litigation settles. Which means Iron Vale takes over. Eventually. Garrett stared toward the mountains surrounding the farm. The war had finally moved into daylight. Sheriff Granger lowered his voice further. Nathan Crowley's been meeting privately with county officials all week. Garrett almost smiled. Not from humor. Recognition. He'd seen this strategy overseas before. Apply pressure legally. Destabilize targets publicly. Break morale before direct confrontation. Corporate warfare wasn't much different from military operations, after all. When's the hearing? Tomorrow morning. Garrett nodded once. Good. The sheriff frowned slightly. You don't sound worried. Garrett folded the notice carefully. I'm done running from people like this. The next morning, Blackwater Ridge Town Hall overflowed with people long before the hearing began. Snowmelt dripped steadily from rooftops outside while pickup trucks lined both sides of Main Street. Inside, tension filled the old wooden building like static electricity. Farmers, veterans, local business owners. Nearly the entire town had shown up. Garrett entered with Hawk beside him and immediately felt every eye in the room shift toward him. Some sympathetic, some nervous, some afraid. Nathan Crowley stood near the front, wearing another expensive gray suit that looked absurdly polished against the worn mountain town around him. Several county board members sat behind long tables beneath fluorescent lights, while Iron Vale attorneys organized thick stacks of paperwork nearby. Crowley smiled faintly when Garrett entered. Predator confidence, like he already believed the outcome belonged to him. Garrett ignored him. Hawk limped quietly beside his chair near the back wall, while Sheriff Granger and Clara took seats nearby. The hearing began promptly at 9. Environmental concerns, fire risks, unregistered underground structures. Iron Vale attorneys spoke for nearly 40 minutes using charts, maps, and legal language designed to bury ordinary people beneath complexity. Garrett listened silently. Then Nathan Crowley finally stood. The room quieted immediately. Crowley walked slowly toward the center floor carrying a thin folder. Ladies and gentlemen, he began smoothly, this matter is unfortunate. Garrett already hated the tone. Iron Vale Development attempted repeatedly to resolve this situation privately and compassionately. Compassionately. Garrett clenched his jaw. Crowley continued. Instead, the current owner has demonstrated instability, aggression, and complete inability to manage this property safely. There it was. The real attack. Crowley opened the folder dramatically. Mr. Garrett Boone is a homeless drifter suffering from severe combat-related psychological trauma. The room shifted uncomfortably. Garrett remained motionless. Public records show repeated employment termination, documented panic episodes, and untreated post-traumatic stress disorder. Clara looked furious beside him. Sheriff Granger's expression darkened instantly. But Crowley kept going. This man currently resides on dangerous property containing illegal military infrastructure while caring for an aggressive attack dog involved in multiple violent incidents. Hawk growled softly beneath Garrett's chair. Crowley pointed toward him. Exactly my point. Garrett felt old instincts awakening dangerously now. The same cold emotional shutdown he used during combat briefings after losing men. Numbness. Distance. Crowley stepped closer. With respect to Mr. Boone's military service, heroism alone does not qualify someone to manage hazardous land tied to ongoing criminal investigations. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Garrett's breathing slowed carefully. Too carefully. Panic stirred beneath the surface now. Crowded room. Raised voices. Nowhere to exit quickly, his pulse started hammering harder. Not here. Not now. Crowley saw it too. The lawyer's eyes sharpened slightly. He pressed harder. Frankly, this town should ask whether Mr. Boone's trauma makes him a danger to himself and others. The room tilted briefly. Garrett heard distant echoes suddenly. Mortars, radio chatter, men screaming through smoke. His hands trembled once beneath the table. Hawk immediately pressed hard against his leg, grounding him, bringing him back. But Crowley kept talking. He arrived here with no home, no stability, and no demonstrated ability to function independently. Enough! The voice cut sharply across the room. Sheriff Miles Granger stood slowly from his seat. Silence fell instantly. The sheriff removed his glasses carefully. "I buried 2 deputies last year," Granger said quietly. "One from cancer, one from suicide." Nobody moved. Nobody in this room questions what trauma costs. Crowley opened his mouth to respond, but Granger raised a hand. "You don't get to stand in this town and weaponize military service against veterans for corporate profit." A low murmur of agreement spread through the room. Then another man stood. Eli Mercer. "I served with the 10th Mountain Division," Eli said roughly, "and that man's done more honest work on that farm in 1 month than your company's done for this county in 20 years. Another veteran stood beside him. Then another. One by one, men and women throughout the hall rose quietly to their feet. Vietnam veterans, Iraq veterans, old farmers, mechanics, teachers. The entire room shifted. Nathan Crowley looked around slowly as his control slipped. Garrett stared in stunned silence. For years, after leaving the military, he'd felt invisible, disposable, like the world only respected soldiers while they were useful. Now an entire town stood beside him publicly, not out of pity, out of loyalty. Sheriff Granger looked toward Garrett. "You got something you want to show them?" Garrett blinked once, then slowly reached into the worn leather satchel beside his chair. He placed Walter Boone's files heavily onto the hearing table. Photographs, financial records, military contractor documents, property acquisition maps tied to veteran deaths. The room grew very quiet. Garrett finally stood. His voice remained calm, steady. Walter Boone wasn't hiding environmental violations. He looked directly at Nathan Crowley. He was documenting criminal activity. Crowley's confidence vanished instantly. Garrett spread several photographs across the table. "These are records connecting Iron Vale and Argos Defense Solutions to illegal land seizures and fraudulent shell corporations." County officials exchanged nervous glances. Crowley stepped forward sharply. "These documents are stolen property, Capone." "No," Garrett interrupted. "They're evidence." Then the back doors of Town Hall suddenly opened. 3 federal agents entered wearing dark winter coats beneath visible government badges. The entire room froze. Sheriff Granger folded his arms calmly. "Told you I made some calls." Nathan Crowley's face drained of color. One of the agents approached the table slowly. "Mr. Crowley," he said evenly, "we're going to need copies of every land acquisition tied to Iron Vale development over the last 15 years. Crowley stared around the room like a man realizing too late the battlefield had changed. Garrett looked toward Hawk beside him. The old Malinois watched the room quietly, one scarred ear tilted upward, and for the first time since arriving in Vermont, Garrett Boone stopped feeling hunted. Now Iron Vale was the one under siege. The news spread across Vermont within days. Federal investigators searched Iron Vale offices in Burlington and Montpelier. County officials suddenly stopped returning Nathan Crowley's calls. Environmental inspectors reopened old land seizure cases tied to the corporation. For the first time in years, powerful people were answering questions instead of asking them. And up on the mountain above Blackwater Ridge, winter finally began to break. Snow melted slowly across the Boone farm beneath warmer March sunlight. Ice dripped steadily from rooftops while muddy streams cut through the maple groves. The mountains no longer looked hostile. They looked awake. Garrett stood outside the sugar house one cold morning, watching steam rise from his coffee cup into the crisp spring air. The building still carried scars from the fire. New lumber framed sections of the western wall, while fresh roofing covered the burned collapse. Tools and extension cords stretched everywhere as volunteers continued repairs. The farm looked imperfect, but alive. Hawk limped slowly across the yard toward him. The old Malinois still carried stiffness in his injured shoulder, especially during colder mornings, but the dog refused to stay inside for long. Garrett crouched carefully beside him. "You're supposed to be resting." Hawk ignored him completely and sat beside the sugar house door like he always had, guarding. Garrett smiled faintly, despite himself. "Stubborn old bastard." The dog leaned briefly against his side. The gesture hit Garrett harder now than it once did. Before Vermont, he'd spent years moving through life emotionally numb, surviving day by day, existing instead of living. Now mornings had purpose, repairing sap lines, clearing trails, learning the rhythms of the mountain from Walter's journals. Simple things, real things. The kind war often stole from people. Inside the rebuilt section of the sugar house, steam drifted softly through sunlight pouring from high windows. The old evaporator finally worked again. Garrett stood over the machine, studying the temperature gauges exactly how Walter's handwritten notes instructed. "Never rush the boil. Maples teach patience better than soldiers ever do." Walter's voice practically lived inside those journals now. Not haunting, guiding. Garrett adjusted the firebox carefully while warm, sweet air filled the building. The smell of maple syrup had become strangely comforting, like memory turning into something solid. Outside, truck engines echoed up the mountain road. Garrett stepped toward the doorway. Half the town seemed to be arriving again. Eli Mercer climbed from his pickup, carrying toolboxes, while Clara arrived behind him with trays of sandwiches balanced carefully in her arms. Several younger volunteers followed, carrying replacement tubing for the grove. Sheriff Granger pulled up last. The old sheriff leaned against his truck for a moment, studying the repaired farm. "Walter would have liked this," he said quietly. Garrett nodded once. "Feels strange sometimes." "What does?" "Having people around." Granger smiled slightly. "That's called community." Garrett wasn't fully used to the word yet. For years after leaving the military, isolation became easier than connection. Easier than explaining nightmares to people who couldn't understand them. Easier than disappointing everyone once the panic attacks started. But Blackwater Ridge never treated him like damaged goods. They treated him like one of their own. That difference mattered more than Garrett knew how to explain. By late afternoon, warm steam rolled heavily from the sugar house chimney for the first time since Walter Boone died. The entire building glowed amber beneath spring sunlight. Garrett stood beside the evaporator while sap slowly transformed into syrup through heat and patience. Eli dipped a metal spoon into the fresh batch and tasted it carefully. Then he grinned. "That's Boone syrup." Something tightened unexpectedly in Garrett's chest. Not grief this time. Pride. The feeling startled him. He hadn't felt proud of anything in years. Hawk lay near the doorway watching everyone move through the sugar house while laughter echoed softly around the old building. Real laughter. Not forced. Not polite. The sound felt foreign after so many lonely years. Later that evening, Garrett sat alone on the farmhouse porch beneath fading sunset colors stretching across the mountains. The repaired porch creaked softly beneath his boots. Hawk rested nearby with his head across Garrett's feet. The valley below glowed gold beneath the setting sun, while smoke curled lazily from chimneys across Blackwater Ridge. Peaceful. For once, genuinely peaceful. Garrett opened Walter's leather journal again. The pages had become worn from constant reading. Most entries focused on weather patterns and sap yields. But every few pages, Walter wrote something personal too. Today, the mountain was quiet. Quiet enough to hear memory breathing. Garrett stared at the sentence for a long moment. He understood it now. War changes how silence feels. Before combat, silence means peace. Afterward, silence often means danger. But here on the mountain, the quiet slowly became something else again. Healing. The farmhouse door creaked behind him. Clara stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Garrett before sitting carefully beside him. "You missed dinner." "Wasn't hungry." "That's a lie." Garrett almost smiled. Clara looked out toward the valley below. "Town feels different lately." "How so?" "Lighter." Garrett sipped the coffee slowly. "Iron Vale still has lawyers." "Maybe." Clara shrugged. "But fears losing." The statement lingered quietly between them. After a while, Clara spoke again. "You know, Walter always wanted this place to become something bigger than a farm." Garrett looked toward her. "What do you mean?" "He talked about veterans a lot during his later years." Clara folded her hands together against the cold. "Men coming home with nowhere to land." Garrett listened carefully now. He said mountains heal people differently than cities do. The wind moved softly through the maple trees surrounding the house. Garrett glanced down toward Hawk sleeping peacefully beside the chair. Maybe he was right. That night, for the first time in over a decade, Garrett Boone slept through until morning. No explosions, no screaming radios, no burning convoys, just darkness, quiet and deep. When dawn arrived, sunlight streamed gently through the farmhouse windows while birds moved through the maple trees outside. Garrett opened his eyes slowly, confused at first. Then he realized what hadn't happened. No nightmares, no panic, no waking with his hand searching for weapons. He simply sat there for several seconds, staring at the ceiling, while morning light filled the room. Hawk lifted his head from the rug near the bed and thumped his tail once against the floor. Garrett laughed softly under his breath. A real laugh. Small, but real. Outside, spring finally reached the mountain. Sap buckets hung beneath thousands of maple trees across the grove. Fresh steam rose from the sugar house chimney. Volunteers arrived carrying tools and coffee. And somewhere deep inside himself, Garrett Boone realized the war inside him was finally beginning to loosen its grip. Not because the pain disappeared, not because the memories were gone, but because he finally had something stronger than survival. He had a reason to stay. Spring settled fully over Blackwater Ridge by late April. The mountains softened beneath green pine and fresh maple buds, while long rivers of snowmelt rushed down rocky slopes toward the valley below. The Boone farm no longer looked abandoned from the road. It looked alive. Fresh smoke curled steadily from the rebuilt sugar house chimney each morning. New maple lines stretched cleanly through the grove. The farmhouse windows glowed warmly at night, instead of staring dark and empty across the mountain. Walter Boone's war-torn little kingdom had finally started breathing again. Garrett stood near the evaporator one dawn watching amber syrup pour slowly into metal containers beneath rising clouds of sweet steam. The smell filled the sugar house completely now. Warm maple, wood smoke, spring air, life. Hawk rested near the doorway in a patch of sunlight. Older and slower now, but finally healed enough to move without pain. A faint limp remained in his shoulder, but the dog carried it proudly. Battle scars. Soldiers understood those. Garrett glanced toward him and smiled faintly. "You getting lazy in retirement?" Hawk thumped his tail once against the wooden floor. Outside, trucks slowly climbed the mountain road, carrying volunteers from town for the final maple harvest weekend. Blackwater Ridge had practically adopted the Boone farm by now. Children helped carry sap buckets. Retired veterans repaired fencing. Neighbors brought meals without asking. Some evenings, the farmhouse kitchen became so crowded, Garrett barely recognized his own home anymore. Home. The word no longer felt temporary. That still amazed him. Months earlier, he'd been sleeping beneath a Denver overpass, believing his life had already ended. Now he woke every morning to mountain sunlight spilling across pine forests older than memory itself. The legal fight with Iron Veil continued, but the corporation was collapsing fast under federal investigation. Several executives resigned. Argos Defense Solutions lost government contracts. Nathan Crowley disappeared from Vermont entirely after subpoenas reached the company offices. The predators had finally been dragged into daylight. And somehow, Walter Boone had known this day would come. Garrett stepped outside the sugar house carrying 2 mugs of coffee, while dawn spread slowly across the valley. The mountains glowed gold beneath early sunlight. Birdsong echoed through the maple grove. Peace. Real peace. Sheriff Granger arrived first that morning, climbing from his truck with an old cardboard box balanced beneath one arm. "Morning," he called. Garrett handed him coffee. "What's in the box?" "Something Walter left with the county clerk years ago." The sheriff set it carefully on the porch railing. "Said it was only for you once the investigations were over." Garrett frowned slightly. That old man really did plan everything. You have no idea. Granger climbed back into his truck after a few minutes, leaving Garrett alone with the box and the mountain silence. Hawk limped over beside him while Garrett slowly opened the lid. Inside sat legal folders, photographs, and one final sealed envelope. Garrett recognized Walter's handwriting instantly. For Garrett. Last letter. His chest tightened gently now instead of painfully. He opened it carefully. If you're reading this, then the mountain held long enough. Garrett smiled sadly to himself. That sounded exactly like Walter. The letter continued. I always believed land remembers the people who fight for it. Maybe that sounds foolish, but mountains keep promises better than men do. Garrett looked out across the valley while sunlight touched the upper ridges. Walter's words felt alive somehow inside the morning air. The next page contained legal documents, trust agreements, property transfers. Garrett read slowly, then stopped cold. Walter Boone had placed nearly half the Boone property into a protected veterans land trust years earlier. The trust legally prevented future corporate development forever. Garrett stared at the paperwork in disbelief. The farm could never be sold to developers. Never mined. Never destroyed. Walter had protected the mountain even after his own death. There was more. The trust charter included plans for transitional housing cabins, therapy trails through the maple groves, and rehabilitation space for retired military working dogs. Garrett slowly sat down on the porch steps. Walter hadn't simply left him a farm. He'd left him a mission, a purpose bigger than grief, bigger than survival. Tears blurred Garrett's vision slightly as he continued reading. You spent your life protecting people, son. I hoped one day this mountain might finally protect you back. Hawk rested his head gently against Garrett's shoulder. Garrett closed his eyes briefly. For years after war, he believed healing meant forgetting. Forgetting the dead. Forgetting the nightmares. Forgetting the parts of himself combat destroyed. But the mountain taught him something different. Healing wasn't forgetting. It was learning how to carry the pain without letting it bury you. Later that afternoon, the final maple harvest began beneath brilliant spring sunlight. Steam rolled heavily from the sugar house, while volunteers moved through the grove laughing and carrying sap buckets beneath fresh green leaves. Children chased each other through the muddy trails. Old veterans traded stories beside pickup trucks. Music drifted softly from a portable radio near the porch. Life everywhere. Garrett stood on the rocky ridge overlooking the entire valley, while Hawk sat beside him watching the farm below. From up there, the Boone property stretched across the mountainside like something reclaimed from darkness itself. The rebuilt sugar house, the farmhouse chimney smoking peacefully, the endless maple forest surrounding everything. Garrett thought about the two paths laid before him back in Denver. Take the money, disappear, or come here, fight, stay. He understood now that Walter Boone had never truly given him land. The old man gave him belonging. A way back home after war hollowed him out. Evelyn Price climbed the ridge path carrying a folder tucked beneath her arm. You picked a good view, she said softly. Garrett nodded toward the valley. Hard to believe this almost disappeared. Evelyn smiled faintly. Walter made sure it wouldn't. She handed him another document. The Veterans Trust officially cleared federal approval yesterday. Garrett looked down at the paperwork. Boone Mountain Veterans Retreat. The name hit him harder than expected. You really gonna do this? Evelyn asked quietly. Garrett looked back toward the farm below, toward the cabins planned near the tree line, toward the old sugar house where broken soldiers and retired military dogs might someday heal together beneath these mountains. Then he looked at Hawk beside him. The scarred old Malinois stared peacefully across the valley, with one ear twitching in the spring wind. Garrett smiled softly. Yeah, he said. I think we are. The sun dipped lower behind the green mountains, casting long golden shadows across the maple grove below. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The mountain said enough on its own. Garrett finally rested one hand against Hawk's neck, while the old dog leaned gently into him. Some men came home from war with medals. Others came home with scars. But sometimes, if they were lucky, they came home to something worth staying for. Type yes in the comments. If you believe some land, some memories, and some people are worth fighting for no matter the cost. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life from nothing, tell us where you're watching from tonight. These stories are for the folks who still believe in loyalty, justice, and standing your ground. Subscribe if you want more stories about second chances, hard-earned peace, and the people who refuse to back down.